Okay, right on time. Welcome everyone to our annual general meeting of the Mississauga Center. Usually there is a massive snowstorm on the evening of our annual general meeting. So what we've done in the past is just started the evening with a short talk. And so normally we get someone from the center to give a short talk before the meeting. So there'll be a talk and then a break where we'll have some refreshments, and we have a raffle. And tonight, if you purchase 3 raffle tickets, you get 2 solar viewers for free and a guarantee of either clear or cloudy skies on April 8th. All right, so everyone hear me okay? All right. So with the upcoming eclipse in a few weeks, I thought it might be kind of nice to look back at some previous eclipses that some of us or many of us might have seen, but also some that have some historic significance. Who here was at the August 30th, 1905? This eclipse probably would not have had much historical significance if it weren't for a fellow named Mr. Maybe. And he was on this trip and he kept a scrapbook. And Mr. Maybe, his son, who was probably not very old in 1905, because when I met him in the 80s, he was in his mid-80s. He donated his father's scrapbook and telescope to the society, to the Toronto Center actually, but now it's property of the society. And this scrapbook had a picture of the people on the trip, had signatures by everyone on the trip, and had newspaper clippings, had flower pressings. It was amazing. It is now in the archive at the National Office. So if you ever want to go flip through it, it's kind of neat. What's interesting is there are some people on here whose names you might recognize. Dr. and Mrs. Maunder of the famous Maunder minimum, Plaskett, Chant, and a lot of other people who through the early years of the society were presidents of the society. So that's kind of neat. But what's also interesting, I was mentioning this to Matteo recently, is that there's a D.B. Marsh from Hamilton, and you can see his signature on the right-hand side there. So I'm wondering if this is the fellow whose telescope Matteo now owns, and did that telescope go on this trip? That's kind of cool. The last central total solar eclipse to go through Toronto was in January 1925. This was famous for the fact that it went through downtown New York. And as I think Ron McNaughton mentioned at the last meeting, people were set up at street corners. And their job was to notice, is it total or is it partial? And it's interesting that this particular headline says eclipse 4 seconds late. So even back in 1925, they were refining their equations on eclipses and lunar motion and that kind of thing. There was a large RASC contingent expedition headed by Dr. Chant to the Hamilton area. And all of the journals back to the beginning are online at University of Harvard database. And so this one starts out, as far as Ontario is concerned, the recent eclipse was a great disappointment. It was cloudy. So that's too bad. 1963, there were a couple others. We had a totally, in Canada, we had a total eclipse in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, and in 1963, the summer of 63. And I put this in here because it's kind of close to Toronto. It's just a drive up to in between Montreal and Quebec. So many of us probably would have made that drive. It was not very nice here in Toronto. There were thunderstorms, but it says here that that there were no eclipse injuries at any of the hospitals in Toronto, so that's good. But clouds did open and allow a view of the eclipse in Grand Mare, Quebec. March 7th, 1970 was an eclipse that a lot of people looked forward to just because it went through a populated area in the East Coast. And there were a lot of people in Florida and South and North Carolina, and they were just hit by clouds. It was just an awful day, unfortunately, as was Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. There was some clearing up near Virginia. Friends of ours, David Foote and Joyce Feinberg, many of you might have heard of David Foote before through the stamp world. They saw their first eclipse, and this was the first partial eclipse I ever saw. It was a Saturday afternoon. I learned how to make a pinhole camera, and there were a couple live broadcasts. I watched ABC. I went on the internet and found a CBS version, but these things are on YouTube. So if you're really interested, it went through Mexico, and National Geographic put out a great edition later on with Jay Pasakoff being down in Mexico and seeing a clear sky eclipse. So not long after, in July 1972, there was an eclipse down through Quebec, the Gaspé, PEI, and Nova Scotia. So I was already an RASC member at that time, and I signed up for this, and this was a bus ride. And so I was 14 years old, and my parents were sticking me on a bus to go out to the Maritimes and back. And they did that in those days, I guess. But what was interesting is on the way out, it was an overnight trip, but the bus drivers could only drive a certain amount of time. And that basically got them to Quebec. Then they had to change drivers. But the driver didn't show up at the bus station. So we had to drive into the depths of Quebec City in the middle at 2 or 3 in the morning, looking for this guy's house to find this bus driver. So this whole trip was full of adventure. On the way home along the 401, again, overnight, there had been a big prison break at Millhaven. And so there were OPP all over the 401. All the cars were stopped. Everyone had to get off the bus and everything. So it was, for a 14-year-old, that was a cool trip. I'll get there. So when we signed up for this, Ralph Chu, many of you may know Ralph Chu, he was actually working, I don't know if it's part-time, I'll have to ask him part-time or full-time at the Science Center. But what we did is there were 3 or 4 of us who went into the Science Center for like every Saturday for weeks and used the telescopes that the Science Center had and tested and took pictures and developed the film. And it was a great experience to get ready for this thing. One of us had infrared film to take pictures of the sun. Others had different types of film, all just to try to capture the picture, the eclipse in different ways. So that's me at the bottom there, 14-year-old geek, or just nerd, or well, I don't know what I was back then, but I was fascinated by this telescope. The Toronto Center member at the time, his name was Moody Kaldfleisch. He made that telescope from scratch, the telescope and the mount. And the night before the eclipse, it was perfectly clear, and we were up most of the night. And it was the first time I'd ever done deep sky observing. So that was a great experience. The next morning, it was perfectly clear until about an hour before first contact. Then it started raining. Yeah, so that was too bad. There was one fellow, Jim Lowe, on the right-hand side there, sitting at his table. He just sat there for hours taking weather observations, temperatures, pressures, that kind of thing. But there were really no signs of things getting better. So all I could really do is take pictures at the same exposure of the decreasing light. And you can see it was getting pretty dark just before totality. This was totality. I think I captured something of the eclipse with a 135 millimeter camera, but it definitely caught the sunset colors and over the Baie de Chaleur. But I was really impressed. It was the only eclipse that I've been clouded out. And I was really impressed with the end of the eclipse. because you could, with the clouds, you could really see the speed of the edge of the moon shadow at 2,000 kilometers an hour. It was remarkable. So fortunately, it's the only cloudy one I've ever seen. But even if you see a cloudy eclipse in a couple of weeks, it is remarkable, the changing light levels and everything. So there were a lot of media, of course, talking about the eclipse. It was clear in Toronto, of course. Less than a year later, in June 1973, there was an eclipse through Africa. And this was one of the, there are groups of eclipses that are either longer or shorter. And there was one in 1991 that I'll talk about in a minute. It was 7 minutes long. This one was also 7 minutes long. It was on the same Saros cycle. And a lot of people who were on our 1972 trip went on a boat trip, the Canberra, off the coast of Africa, and saw the eclipse there. I didn't go on that, but what was interesting is this is the first eclipse where a Concorde was flying and actually flew along the path of totality and experienced 70 minutes of totality. So what was really cool about this is that they cut a hole. The sun was at the zenith, and they cut holes in the fuselage so that they could fit instrumentation in the plane and do a lot of things that you couldn't normally do. And what's cool is that at Le Bourget in Paris, that Concorde, which was the first Concorde, is on display along with all the instrumentation that they used. So you can see there's the telescope that they pointed out through the roof. And so that was actually quite a historic eclipse. All right, back to Canada. And this was the great February 1979 eclipse in Manitoba. And if anyone's ever been to Manitoba in January or February, you know that it might be a bit of a challenge. So it was another Toronto Centre expedition run by Michael Watson. So two Convair aircraft, 50-seat aircraft, were chartered. We met at the airport, met at Pearson at 3 a.m, flew to Winnipeg, refueled, flew up to an airport at Gimli, Manitoba. And if any of you know the history of the airport at Gimli, Manitoba, a few years after the 1979 eclipse, it was where the Air Canada 757 glided in for an emergency landing when it ran out of fuel. But when we were there, it was an airport. So it was a bit of a challenge to set up right on the tarmac in the cold. A lot of people just loaded their cameras with film and put them on the telescopes. I kept my camera in my coat, a little concerned of what will happen it was about minus 25 degrees. So I'm concerned about what would happen to plastic film. And in fact, a lot of people did suffer shattered film because of that. But it wasn't perfectly clear. There were some cirrus clouds. And we did have the option of getting in the planes and flying above the clouds. But we realized that, or we were told that the planes would not make it above the cirrus clouds. So we were stuck on the ground. But I think all in all, that was a great decision. So that's the first eclipse that I saw and photographed. A nice short exposure. The prominences for this eclipse were stunning. And yeah, it was also kind of neat because the cirrus clouds gave sort of a medium for the edge of, you could see the edge of the shadow of the moon coming across, projected on the shadow of the cirrus clouds at the end. So that was quite cool. And so there we all are, about 100 people from the Toronto Centre. We were back by dinner time, so it was a great day. I think it cost $250 or something like that back then. Still, that's a pretty good deal. So several people back in the Toronto Centre at that time put together a slideshow. They got pictures from a lot of people on the trip and put together a slideshow, but it was really archaic because you needed 3 slide projectors and you needed to coordinate them and whatever. So for the 40th anniversary, I got all the slides, got the audio, and put together a video and presented it at a Toronto Centre meeting. And it's on the Toronto Centre YouTube, just in case you're interested. So that was kind of neat. Less than a year later, another Toronto Centre expedition, this one to a rather a warmer site in Kenya. And to me, this was one of the more amazing trips. You know, you don't choose where you go to see an eclipse. The eclipse has chosen it for you. But this was an opportunity to see a really amazing part of the world. And you know, when you go to the zoo, all these animals are in pens and whatever. But I really felt like I was sort of the visitor or the intruder when I saw when we literally drove across the Serengeti. So we were there for 2 weeks, and made it to the equator. Now we were out when it was clear. We would go out. I mean, this is for a lot of us. It was our first view of the southern sky. So this was I don't know how long this exposure would have been, but being on the equator, pointing south, you can easily see the Southern Cross and Eta Carinae and Canopus. Again, this is back in the world of 400 ASA film, so I think a camera today could have done a nicer job. So each of the lodges where you would go to, there'd be 4 or 5 lodges in Kenya, and you go to various lodges. Each of them had an airstrip. And you begin to, why does each lodge have an airstrip? Well, of course, that's the way you evacuate people who get attacked by lions or whatever animals that, you know. I mean, that's the kind of thing I thought, like, why all this emphasis on an airstrip? Anyway, to set up for the eclipse, we set up at the end of an airstrip at Voi. And so we set our telescopes up on the numbers of the azimuth of the runway, and had a nice clear day. So this eclipse is interesting because it was around solar max, which is what we are going to see this year. And so the corona is more circular. And in fact, there were a lot of solar max missions back in 1980, satellites to go in and analyze the sun. But this was kind of interesting. Afterwards, we noticed this this sort of an opening here. And if you hear this, there's a circular image here. And after the Sky and Telescopes came out after this, they said that there had been actually, during the eclipse, a coronal mass ejection. And they called it the tennis racket. And it was one of the best ones they had ever seen. And it was interesting, by the time the eclipse got across the Indian Ocean to India, the structure had disappeared. So it was not there for long. So that was kind of neat to capture that. And the group, a few people you may know in here: Ralph Chu from the Toronto Centre, David Foote from the Toronto Centre, and Bob McCall. Many of you remember Bob. He was on that trip as well. Ian McGregor, Andreas Gatta. Yeah, so it was a great experience. A few years later, we were back in North America. This eclipse was interesting. This was as close to what they call a hybrid eclipse, where you get an annular at both ends of the path, but then a total in the middle, just because of as the path moves along the Earth, the moon appears a little closer, or the shadow gets bigger, and it's kind of a strange thing. But this wasn't quite total. It was close enough that you would get diamond rings around the entire sun during maximum eclipse. So they called this the diamond necklace. And it was a tough thing to photograph. My photographs did not turn out because I didn't choose the right exposure. But we went down to Richmond, Virginia, and got up the morning of the eclipse, and it was totally socked in. But we had an airline pilot on the trip, and he called a few weather stations, and he said, drive 250 miles southwest and you'll get clear skies. And that's what we did. So we showed up in a little place in North Carolina and zipped into the high school and asked if we could set up our stuff on the grounds, and saw the eclipse. There's Michael Watson he doesn't carry much equipment when when he travels on these things. So this is a picture on the left-hand side by Ralph Chu, and you can see that if you had the right exposure, you could get chromosphere, you could get prominences. Corona was tough. The pictures on the right were mine just with a 135 millimeter lens. But my exposures were all wrong, and I didn't come out well. But the interesting thing was, looking through the viewfinder, I could see corona. And that's important because the next eclipse we went to 6 months later was a total eclipse. And Michael and I looked, we did not see anything in literature where someone has seen corona at 2 eclipses in 1 calendar year. It just doesn't happen. You either get an annular total or a partial total. So that was kind of neat, but it was a very, very unique eclipse. So 6 months later, Betty and I and Michael and his friend, we were in Papua New Guinea in a very small fishing village near the center line there called Hula. No electricity, no running water, but 100 kilometers east of Port Moresby. And it was just like being at the ends of the earth. We went into the school and asked if we brought tents. So we were essentially camping in Papua New Guinea. And we set up on the schoolyard. We always had little ones sitting and watching what the heck we were doing. And the chances of clear skies was about 25%. And the day of the eclipse, it's perfectly clear. It just worked out. But the thing about this eclipse, totality was only about 53 seconds. And so with a 53-second eclipse at contacts, you have a very, very thin, narrow, nearly 180-degree crescent, and also a lot of chromosphere. So this is the schoolmaster, Henry Arisa, and he, you can't see, but he's a projection of the eclipse on his belly there. He grew up in Hula. He was educated in the UK, and then he came back to run the school. And the interesting thing was 18 months before this eclipse, in June 1983, another total eclipse that a lot of people saw in Indonesia went through the same place. And they were all inside because they didn't know how to properly observe it. So what we did is the day before the eclipse, we talked to the kids and told them how to properly observe the eclipse. And they were all outside and they watched it. So you can see on the left that that's like nearly 180-degree chromosphere, and actually 2 little diamond rings there. So that was a great trip, and you can see Betty's got the champagne bottle there. But that was amazing, and the field behind us, I don't know how many people there were from. We always run into a lot of people from all over the world, but there were buses and buses of people from Japan that came overnight. They set up in the fields, and there are a lot of atom and eclipse chasers from Japan. A few years later, we were back in the South Pacific, this time to the Philippines and the southern island of Mindanao at General Santos City. And this was another Toronto Centre expedition. And we had a great time there. The night before, this was not long after the revolution. And so we had a tour of the big palace, and we saw Imelda Marcos's supply of shoes and dresses, and all still with the price tags on. But also there was still the feeling of post-revolution, freedom. It was quite neat. There's Chris setting up his telescope. This is the one picture I've ever seen of an approaching shadow during a total eclipse, and David Foote grabbed this. You can tell that the sunlight on this fellow in front, we're still seeing sunlight, still seeing photosphere. but look at the darkness of the sky, and you can begin to even see sunset colors. So that is outside. This is just the edge of the shadow approaching where we are. So it's a unique photograph. This was another great eclipse for prominences. But there was this cloud deck that was approaching, and we didn't know if it was going to reach us before totality or whatever. And we were very fortunate. We saw about half of totality before the cloud deck moved in. And you see, I don't carry a lot of equipment as well. I don't know how the heck I got that to the Philippines, to be quite honest. What's interesting too, if you're used to setting up an equatorial mount, is look at the angle of my equatorial mount there. We were at like 10 degrees, so it's nearly horizontal. And there's the group. And the fellow on the top right-hand corner, that's Jim Lowe from the 1972 eclipse, the weather guy. And he brought his 2 daughters on this trip. So you can see Chris and Liz Malicki there, Dave Foote, and Michael Watson, Betty and I. All right, so the big eclipse of the same Saros cycle of 1973 was 1991. This was the 7-minute eclipse. This is the one that everyone wanted to go to. It went right through Hawaii, went right through the big island of Hawaii, right over Mauna Kea, and then over southern Baja California, went through Mexico. That's got to be it went through Mexico City. It's got to be the largest city that a total eclipse has ever gone through, and then down through Central America. So Michael and I organized a trip to Baja. We had two trips there before the eclipse to set everything up. So we were right there on the center line, just north of Los Cabos. And we ended up being in a soccer field. And we got there, it was beautifully clear, hot as heck. But the thing is that this was a strange eclipse because near totality, the sun was at the zenith. And that's kind of a difficult thing to observe and to photograph. Terry Dickinson was on the trip. And a fellow who had seen an article about the eclipse, who was making a film about with an eclipse as the theme. His name is Jeremy Podeswa. He brought a 35 millimeter camera to shoot the eclipse for his film, and he borrowed an equatorial IMAX mount, although he didn't use it as equatorial anyway. So anyway, if you're interested, there's an eclipse. There's a film out there by Jeremy Podeswa called Eclipse. Although anyone who's familiar with Game of Thrones or some of those other HBO things, he's directed quite a few of those. He went on to bigger and better things, including Game of Thrones. So interesting guy. Unfortunately, as it cooled, as we got close to totality, clouds condensed, and we had a little bit of overcast. And Chris, you calculated how much of that eclipse we saw. Do you remember? Yeah, a few minutes out of the 7. No, it was really too bad. All right, so a few years later, we were back home, and this was since 1925, the first time a central eclipse had passed over Toronto, Mississauga. Unfortunately, it was an annular eclipse. So a lot of people went down to Point Pelee. You see Point Pelee Park there is right on the center line. I hosted a live TV show in front of the planetarium. And on the left there, you see my guest, Dr. Don McCrae. Dr. McCrae was the director of the DDO in the University of Toronto Astronomy Department for many years. And if any of you have ever seen the National Film Board film Universe from the early 1960s, it features an astronomer at the DDO, a young astronomer. That was Don McCrae. He was the honorary president of the Toronto Centre for a while. He was a really, really nice man. And during my interview, we talked about the 1925 eclipse that he saw from Toronto as a young student. And he confirmed that, yeah, it was cloudy. On the right is Tom Clark, the last director of the planetarium. And he was a nice guy. After he passed away, he donated all of his archive material of the planetarium to the Society archives. There's Steve Spinney, a former president of the Toronto Centre. I think he was overseeing my unit there because the video was going not only to our show, but it was going to City TV. It was going to Much Music. Ziggy was actually calling the eclipse. If anyone remembers Ziggy Lawrence from Much Music, she was talking to pet psychiatrists though about how the eclipse would affect pets. So that was I have that video, by the way, if you're interested. It's pretty classic. So there's my picture of maximum eclipse. And if I just go back to the site, you'll see that the northern limit really just passes at Bloor Street. And so the planetarium being right on Bloor Street, we were just at the northern limit of the annular eclipse. All right, a few years later, a lot of people went down to the Mediterranean. Not necessarily Montserrat, because there had just been a big volcano, but Aruba and Curacao. A lot of people went down to Aruba and Curacao. We went to the Galapagos Islands, mainly because we'd been there a few years before. Betty and I went down there with some other Toronto Centre members and actually observed Comet Halley from the Galapagos and actually lugged all that equipment down. I can't believe we lugged all that equipment down. And the interesting thing is you have to be on a boat to visit the Galapagos. But the Galapagos Islands are owned by Ecuador, and they are a national park. And the park closes at sunset. So we actually had to get permission from Ecuador to go on shore to look at the comet back in 1986. For the eclipse in 1998, we had to travel a little bit north of the main islands of the Galapagos on this converted research vessel. So I don't remember how many people, or maybe there were 80 people on that boat. The interesting thing was our group was rather small, and everyone else on the boat were just there for a Galapagos tour. And then they found out, oh, by the way, there's going to be a total eclipse, and they had no idea. So that was a real bonus. This is one of the highlights of the Galapagos, Bartolome Island and Pinnacle Rock. If you ever get a chance, Galapagos is just an amazing place to visit. The next year, for the first time in a long time, an eclipse was passing through Europe. We went to just north of Paris. Being 1999, the Eiffel Tower had a countdown number of days to the year 2000. So the day of the eclipse, we drove north of Paris towards the center line and hit the most amazing traffic jam I think I've ever seen in my life. Traffic just stopped. And you could get out, you could walk around. And at a certain point, the partial phases started. And so we said, forget it. We got out of the car, set up our flag, and set up on the side of the road beside a cornfield. And the clouds didn't look good. And then amazingly enough, 10 minutes beforehand, it cleared perfectly around the sun. And it was one of the best chromospheres I think I've ever seen with prominences. It was a spectacular eclipse. And a lot of people in Europe were not fortunate. Like I think in Germany, it was pretty overcast. So that was a memorable eclipse. Christmas Day 2000, it was a partial eclipse. So there's our daughter Beth celebrating Christmas. In 2006, there was an eclipse that went through Libya and then through Turkey. I this isn't because I was kicked off the tour or anything. Betty and Beth had gone to Europe the year before, and so I was on my own for this one. And I was just blown away by all of the structures and in Turkey and what we saw. So I just had a moment there, just sort of sitting, and somebody took the picture. But it does look like I've been kicked off the boat or something. Yeah, well, you know me. This eclipse site was the best ever. You know, there were friends of ours who were in Libya. 4-hour bus tour to get to the site, half-hour lineups in the desert to go to the washroom. And here I am on the front lawn. There's the hotel. You don't see it, but there are guys walking around with beers and, you know, what can I get you kind of thing. And the Mediterranean, a couple, you know, like 100 feet away. It was amazing. It was fantastic. So Chris and Liz Malicki were on this trip as well. And beautifully clear skies that day. This was my first eclipse with a DSLR. So these pictures are 6 pictures taken within 11 seconds, just to give you an idea. Now I put this up here because I'm kind of wondering if that's on the left, a 99.8% or something eclipse. It's hard to tell. But I think the pictures tend to, you know, shut down the dazzle of the photosphere. So, you know, I've been wondering what we would see if we were seeing a 99.8, 99.7% eclipse. But anyway, having the DSLR was great. Beautiful eclipse. We had one fellow from, I don't know if he's Toronto Center, but he lives in Toronto, Mike Ma. He shot this picture, and this to me captures very closely what a naked eye view of a total eclipse looks like. So this was actually a Calgary Center trip, Don Haladiuk and whatever. So that was a great time. Now for this eclipse, it was known beforehand that the ISS could be passing over the Mediterranean during totality. And in fact, it did. So this is a picture from the ISS on the top left-hand corner of the shadow. And this is Crete here. So this is Turkey here. And we are right in the smack darn in, sorry, Cyprus, thank you. This is where we were. So this astronaut here, Bill MacArthur, was on that expedition. And I thought if I ever get a chance, oh, it says, oh yeah, okay. If I ever get a chance to meet him, wouldn't it be cool to say, hey, you know, you saw the eclipse, I was down there. And at the last shuttle mission, NASA had all these social media groups where you could send in an email and they'd pick 100 or so and they'd invite you down. You'd be on the press site and whatever. So I was walking around. I just took that picture. And when I got home, I noticed, oh, look, there's Bill MacArthur. And I had a chance to talk to him, but I didn't realize he was there. So anyway, maybe one day I have a chance to talk to him about his seeing a total eclipse from a different perspective. Huh? Oh, okay. Oh, hurry. Oh, I see what you're saying. I thought you were telling me to. Actually, I need to. Anyway. All right. This is an eclipse that some members here saw, an annular eclipse in the western US. I think Chris and Val and Alan saw this from Arizona. Back home from the top of Centennial Park, the sunset was rather interesting. A year later, another hybrid eclipse. This was an annular total that went through Africa, but you'll notice that Toronto is just in the limit. So we had the one and only to date Mississauga Center eclipse expedition to Jack Darling Park. Was it? Is that where we went? Saw the sunrise, partially eclipsed for a few minutes. And then we opened champagne. Well, we didn't open champagne, but it was November. But anyway, that was the first expedition. And now we have another expedition coming up. October 23rd was just a partial eclipse at sunset. Again, a group appeared on the top of Centennial Park in Etobicoke. Nice big sunset group on for this eclipse. And because it was west looking towards the airport, we had an opportunity to capture a few interesting things. And I call the one on the right my shark fin eclipse. And then the one that many of us were at just a few years ago. We were in Idaho at a cowboy ranch. Beautiful eclipse, a lot of neat prominences. Regulus just to the below and left of the sun. Super eclipse. A nice long exposure. I wanted to capture some of the Mare. I think there's some there. I could probably enhance that a little bit, but you can see some of the features on the moon. I can see Copernicus there pretty easily. And from space, there's the shadow passing over the West US. So that was great. Success. This was the only eclipse where I had my computer totally controlling the camera. I didn't touch the camera during the total eclipse. Yeah. 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 So cheers to everyone who was at Riverwood. 2021, the sunrise eclipse, the annular. These are the two horns of the sun just rising over Lake Ontario. And a fantastic picture by our executive director, Jenna Hines. So this is coming up. Missed us by just that much. And in fact, if you look at how many, that's just a couple kilometers out from the Toronto Center Islands. So if it was a little warmer, I would think you could just go down to the Boulevard Club or whatever and grab a sailboat and head out. And my last slide is the next eclipse. October 26th, 2144. So we'll see you all then. Thanks very much.